All right, we're online now. Thank you all for coming. Thank you, Jay, for accepting our invite to Angular Birmingham. Everybody here probably loves Angular, NgRx, and Nest. If not, definitely look into all of them and NX as well to put them all nicely together. But yeah, let's see what Jay has to tell us about this. Over to you, Jay.
Great. Thanks a lot, Alex. Okay, so thank you everyone for joining me today to chat about NgRx Data, WebSockets, and Nest. Who am I? I'm the co-founder and CTO of Trusted.org. So as I said, we're a social enterprise and for charities and nonprofits. I'm an open source contributor in my favorite projects are Nest, Next, and NgRx. We'll talk about 2 to 3 of those today, and the actual demo repo that I'll share after the fact is built with NX. I'm the author of a book about Nest, and then I'm working on another one about building NX repos from the ground up. So kind of getting it all the way up to production. And then I'm a beard aficionado. So as you can see, I have various styles in my beard, large, medium, and small. So what is NgRx? It's a collection of libraries for building reactive applications in Angular. This is taken directly from the website, so not something that I wrote up myself. NgRx Store itself is NgRx state management solution. So you might have heard of other state management solutions such as...
Sorry, Jay, can you unmute yourself, please? I've should have muted everybody, so just to make sure you're back online.
Can you guys hear me?
Yep.
Okay, cool. So back to it. There's many other state libraries out there, NgXS, Akita, and then I'm sure there's a million of them. So today we're going to be talking about NgRx Data, and then by extension, Store and Effects. So NgRx Data is an extension that offers a gentle introduction to NgRx by simplifying management of entity data while reducing the amount of explicitness. And you can read more about it on the guides there. So first off, NgRx itself. This is a diagram that's taken directly from the NgRx website. I know some of you aren't familiar with it, so we'll just go through a brief introduction of what it is. So the store, that is the data that's stored in memory currently. So the value of your store. The store is defined by you. NgRx doesn't assume anything about your store. You define it the way you want it, and it's essentially just a collection of objects. Selectors select data from the store. So you would have your store and you say select loading, and it would select the loading property from the store. The component, that's just a plain Angular component. That could also be a service or anything else that you can use a selector in. So whatever you can inject into, you can use selectors in. Actions are things that you tell NgRx you want to do. So you dispatch actions to the store, and then things will happen. So what are those things? One is reducers, and one are effects. Reducers are essentially just plain functions that take this current state of the store, as well as the action being dispatched, and then reduces it and modifies the store based on the logic that you predefine, and then sets the value of the store to what the reducer returns. Effects is more about what we're going to be talking about today. Effects are similar to reducers in that they listen to an action, but then you effects are services. So you can use dependency injection, you can make API calls, you can inject other services. So essentially what an effect is it listens to an action, does some stuff, and then returns one or more actions. And then those actions, again, are dispatched through the reducers and then could trigger other effects, et cetera, et cetera. So that's NgRx at its core. Sorry, I don't have chat open right now. So if there are questions, Alex, can you just let me know to make sure to clarify anything?
Yeah, sure. Yep.
So NgRx Data. Now, this is one that I just threw together. So I know the other one's a lot nicer to look at. I built this presentation, Google Slides. So what are we going to be doing today? We have our component or service, which is, again, just the plain Angular component, plain Angular service. We have our entity data service, which is defined by NgRx Data, our entity metadata, which is defined by us. So say we had like, a product entity, we would have a name, an ID, description, SKU, other stuff like that, right? That defines our entity. The entity data service builds a service, an Angular service based off of that metadata that you can inject into your components and inject into your services. And then it provides all of the features that you're going to need to do CRUD related operations, create, read, update, delete operations on your entity. And then that data service is what actually communicates with the API. So there's quite a few less steps here. Here we have store, selectors, components, actions, reducers, effects. Here we really only have the data service and the entity metadata. You can use selectors and stuff like that with the data service itself. We'll get into that a little bit later. But at its core, this is all you need to use NgRx Data to manage your entities. So with NgRx Store and effects, we're kind of just going to do a comparison here to see what the benefit of doing this is. So this is just some pseudocode, not pseudocode, but like code I wrote up quickly. Don't know if it works. Don't try it. Yeah, disclaimer. I just threw this together quickly. This example only includes the actions and reducers for a single action, which is get by ID. So if you want to query your server for a specific entity based on its primary key, that would be the action that you would then dispatch to the store. The effect would then trigger, call the API, return the value, and then you'd return the success action or the error action if there was an error like a 404 not found or something like that, right? So you can see that there's a ton of boilerplate here, right? And this just gets duplicated for every other action you need to do. So add, delete, get all, get by ID, get with query, and then any other, update would also be in there, right? So it just exponentially grows. So on the left, you can see there's the definition of our entity, which is the story. We have our story state. So that is the shape of the story slice in our NgRx store. Then we have our initial state because it needs to know what to start out with, right? Then we have our actions and then our reducers. So those actions and reducers, those need to get written for all of the other different operations we want to do. So you can see how this can grow out of control very, very quickly for one entity or tens, right? With data, this is all you need. And you get add, delete, get all, get by ID, get with query, update, and then you get your reducers and selectors, and all the effects and API services are all just built in. So what are we doing here with NgRx Data? We have our interface, which again, it's the same one as before. Currently, we just have ID on there, but you'll have name, description, anything else that your story entity might have. Our story metadata, our entity metadata. So before we talked about that, that's what the data service uses to know how to build its service, right? At the minimum, all you need to do is define its entity name. There are other additional properties on there like select ID. So maybe your primary key isn't ID. Maybe it's, story ID. You can define a separate function that says, take in a story entity and return back what its primary key is. It might be a composite, it might be different, who knows. There's also a filter function, a sort comparator, stuff like that. So you can customize your entity, but at its core, all you need to do is define the entity name. And then your data service. You just create your own service that you can use to inject that extends the entity collection service base, and you're ready to go. So in your components and services, you can just inject story data service and then it's called story data service dot add, story data service dot delete, etc. And then everything else that we had to write before is written for us. Okay, demo. So I'll just escape out of here. That's the WebSocket one. So we have two different windows here. We can see the two windows, right? The left and the right. Sorry. So we have our left and our right window. This is using the base implementation of NgRx Data. So that is just using REST, HTTP calls. So, say we have, user 1 and user 2. If user 1 adds new story, user 2 doesn't get that story, right? Because it's just using HTTP, and user 2 is not going to know that user 1 did that. That's the real-time aspect that we'll talk about in a bit. But right now, let's just look at the NgRx store dev tools to see how NgRx Data accomplishes this. If you've never used NgRx store dev tools before and you use NgRx, you should probably download it because it's the most useful feature that you'll ever have. It pretty much just shows you the list of actions that get dispatched, and then the action that was dispatched with its payload, the state at the time the action was dispatched, and then the difference in the state after the action's been processed by the reducers. So what's happening here? I'll clear these. So let's add a new story. We can see the data is dispatching an add one. So that is going to then trigger our effect that we didn't write, and NgRx Data just knows how to do that. Triggers the effect that will make the API call that says, okay, I'm adding a new story. And then it will return, the API will return the story, and NgRx Data will dispatch the add one success, which has this payload, right? The data. So this is just a, new story kind of thing that got added into column one. And then that gets reduced into the store. But again, all we needed to do was define that entity metadata and the data service. So it knocks out like, I don't know, possibly hundreds of lines of codes per entity just by using data with the service here. Okay, so let's go back to here. Okay, so that's the demo of NgRx Data itself. So what are we going to do to add real-time functionality to this now? So I built 3 libraries. You can use just the client and core, or if you're using a Nest server, you can use the server library as well, which essentially just keeps your full stack type safe, so that the client library, your client library knows what to dispatch and what to get back, and then your server knows what it's receiving and then what to dispatch back to the client. So how easy is the Angular code change? So the Angular code change is super, super easy. So on the left, that's the data service that we wrote before. You can ignore the group stories for now. That's just a selector that I wrote. But you can see that you can build selectors to select out of the data store itself, like you could any other type of store, right? After we use the library, we just inject one more thing, and then we extend socket collection service base rather than entity collection service base. Now our service is using WebSockets instead of HTTP as its transfer mechanism. Okay, let's go back to the demo. So now we have, these are the WebSocket ones. Let's clear these. So you can see that if we click add new on the left, the right also gets it. So if the user adds one or, moves one, it moves over. So what's happening here? What's happening is, actually, let's go back to here quickly because I have a diagram for it. So how does this work? So what happens is the component, which has the, the entity data service injected into it, calls the add entity. The data service then will dispatch an action. Sorry, this is for the plain HTTP implementation, not the WebSocket implementation. We'll do the plain one first, and then we'll do the WebSocket after. So it calls add, it dispatches an action, the effect is triggered, your API call is made, your API call is returned, the success or failure actions dispatched back to the data service, and then internally NgRx Data will reduce that data in and then actually return the value to your calling .add method. So typically with NgRx, not data, just plain NgRx, when you dispatch an action, that returns void. You can't respond to that action's response in your component or service because it just dispatches the action and then lets it go. And then, reducers and effects and stuff like that might trigger. But with NgRx Data, you can actually call .add and then .subscribe. And then that subscription will fire and complete when the API call returns back. So how does it accomplish this? What happens is, here's a little bit of pseudocode that I pulled out from the NgRx library itself. It generates a correlation ID when you call the function first. It adds that correlation ID to the action, dispatches the action to the store as you would with plain NgRx, and then it returns a stream of all the actions from the store. But it filters out all of the actions that don't have the same correlation ID, because what happens is your actions dispatched, or dispatched, and then the effects makes a call, but then the success or failure action that's returned from that effect has the same correlation ID. So now what happens is we filter until we find one that has the correlation ID, which is the response, the success or the failure. First, so that we don't get a consistent stream, we need to only get one, right? And then we map the data back. So this allows data, to allow you to subscribe to, add, update, delete, get by one, all of the different functions that NgRx Data supports. So how does this work with WebSockets? So WebSockets don't have a request response architecture, right? So what the libraries do is we kind of take the same process that NgRx Data uses for HTTP and implements the same process for the actual socket events themselves. So we essentially tack on a correlation ID to the WebSocket events for the request and the response, right? Oh, yeah, okay. So what do these actions look like? So let's go back over to the store dev tools quickly. So we'll add one, and you can see that happen on both, right? We're on the WebSocket version of this. So if we look at the store dev tools, the first action that's dispatched is the NgRx Data, not the WebSocket implementation, just the plain data one action, right? This says, okay, I know that I need to add this data. This is before we've gotten to HTTP or WebSocket. This is just telling the NgRx store that this needs to happen. Then the NgRx Data WebSocket save one is dispatched, which then emits a WebSocket event to the server. The server will then, and there's no response per se there, right? But the server will then emit back to this socket as well as any other clients connected, i.e. the right-hand side, the right browser window, a success action or failure, but in this case, it's a success. And it has the data here, but this correlation ID. See, we have CRID 12. This original one, that add one, also had CRID 12. So that our library knows that this success is tied to this request, right? And then this will then take the data, parse out the data, and then dispatch the correct NgRx Data success, so that this one then reduces the data into the store correctly. And then we'll fire the subscription so that you can subscribe to the result and get the result back. So that's how it works at a high level. So there's the GitHub. I'll provide this PDF to Alex after to send to everybody that's attending today. But there's a GitHub repo that just has the minimal example, which is what we are viewing here. This is just a minimal example that has an HTTP route as well as a WebSocket route, which will do both. And then my Twitter, if you want to reach out to me, all the packages are under this NPM organization. And one note I wanted to mention was that this is currently using Socket.io v2 because Nest supports v2 right now. The new version of Nest will be using v3 or v4. I can't remember exactly what one. I know v4 for Socket.io is the newest version, but the typings are a little weird because v2 doesn't really have its own typings, but it was rewritten in TS and v3, so that'll be updated soon. And I just realized the one thing we didn't go over was how does this actually work on the server, right? So let's pull up the code quickly and we'll go away. So I know some of you have said that you have used Nest before and some of you haven't. So again, let Alex know in the chat if you need anything clarified. I can't see the chat right now, but I'll try and walk through what's happening here. So what we're looking at right now is the WebSocket gateway. This is essentially the gateway that's listening on a certain namespace. So our namespace is story, so that the client-side implementation knows to dispatch events to the story namespace. This is a very rough initial implementation. Obviously, in a real example, you're going to have authentication. Only users that have the right permissions can access certain rooms, so that they're not getting events from everybody on the platform and stuff like that. I'm just assuming there's only one stories room here, so that everybody's just connected to the same one. So we're connecting to it here. So how does this work? Let's look at the query all, because it's a simple one. So we're subscribing to the query all method, or the query all event, which is what the client will dispatch to the server, the namespace. We have the socket event body. This is a type that the core package provides, so that the client knows that it dispatches a client event body, as well as the server knows that it's receiving a socket event body, right? And then it needs to return a socket event return of type query all success, so that it knows what form the data needs to be returned in, so that NgRx Data can then reduce that data into the store correctly here. So what are we doing here? We're receiving an event, right? And then we are returning the success of that event with the data. So here we're just using Mongo. We're just finding all the stories and returning all of the stories. So that's a simple one. This one doesn't have anything to do with other clients connected. They don't need to know that someone's querying all, right? They only need to know about changes, so reads or creations, updates, and deletes. So let's go down to update one here. So with update one, the body is socket event body of type socket update request payload of type story, so that it knows that it's receiving an update type of story, and then we'll return a save update one success. This is the event that will be dispatched back to the calling socket, as well as anybody else connected to the room, which in this case is just everybody. So we update the story, right, in Mongo, and then we dispatch the save update one success to everybody else, not the calling socket, to everybody else in the room, so that they get the changes, and then they can then reduce that new data into their store. And then we return the save update one success to the calling socket, so that it can then reduce the data into its store, as well as fire that subscription so that you can respond to it happening. So there's two things happening here. One is we just send the save update one success to everybody else, and then the calling socket has the initial event and then the response event. Let's look at what this looks like in the dev tools. So we're going to add one on the left, right? That should have 4 actions. The original NgRx Data add one, the NgRx Data WebSocket add one, which is the actual event that gets submitted to the gateway. Then the NgRx Data WebSocket success, which is the event that's returned back to the client. And then the NgRx Data success, which is the action that triggers the dispatch. Or sorry, the reducer, not the dispatch. On the right, because we're not actually making the call, we're not going to get those first 2. We're only going to get the latter 2, because all it cares about is it received an event with an update, or in this case, a create, and then it reduces it into the store. So click add one. Here we can see the 4. Data add one, socket add one success, data add one success, right? Over here, we only get the 2, because all it did was it was just sitting here minding its own business, and then it received a WebSocket event that said somebody else added a new story, so you need to add this new story. And then it dispatches the action to NgRx Data that would then reduce the data into the store, and that's why order 1, column 1 here is sitting here, because this socket fired this, which reduced it into the store. Yeah, that's all I got.
Nice. Thank you. Thanks, Jay. Any questions?
I'll pull up the chat now as I can see.
Yeah, there's no questions so far.
I have
Who's
a
got their hands up?
question.
Yeah,
If I
go on.
say, sorry, I didn't know if you were monitoring the hands, functionality. Hi everyone. So I had a similar problem like last year, and I really like to know, how do you manage getting that very first, state from the backend? Because I picture that someone has been, adding things, like adding messages in your example. If someone connected right after you finished adding one, how would that person be getting the correct, status of all the messages that have been added until the point when the new person joined?
Yeah, so what we, I don't think my example does this, but what you can do is on the connect, so like Socket.io will dispatch will fire a connect event once the socket's been connected, or it's connected. It's connect or connected, I'm not sure what one. But you can define a event that is dispatched from your server that says, here's the initial data. That's fired right after connection, so that the socket's connected, it gets the initial data, but it's already connected. So if new events are coming in after it's connected, it also gets those events, and then it'll just reduce everything together. Obviously, there could be some inconsistency issues there. So it is going to be implementation specific, but you'll have to figure out a way so that if there is a holdup on getting a client their initial data, that then they can then say, ask the server, I connected and got my data at this point. Please give me all of the data between this point and when I connected, because I might have missed something. And then your server would then have to be like, dispatch another event that says, here's your missing data between these 2 points. You missed 3 things or 1 thing, or you didn't miss anything. And then and that could be, add 1 successes or update 1 successes or whatever it might be, so that it reduces them into the store correctly. Does that make sense?
Right. Sort of. I'm trying to figure out. So it should get the status, but as actions dispatched from the store, or just, as a regular fetch?
Well, like, it depends. It's really up to you. You could do it with just like HTTP fetch, or you could do it as a a custom socket event on Connect. Whatever works best for you. Right? If you have high traffic, then HTTP, it might not be the best option for you, just because there's lots of stuff going on all at the same time, right? But once the socket's connected, you know that new events are going to come in. So you'll want to find a way to ask the server for the events that happened in between you starting connection and you being connected. So
great, thank you.
And there's, as with programming, there's a million ways to do that.
Yes.
Whatever works best for your application. But that's the
I was hoping for a magical solution you might have had, because we ended up doing something that was quite nasty. We did end up doing, just an API request to the backend outside of the WebSocket, because we needed different customers receive only different slices of that state. So yes, thanks for answering. This is great.
No problem. Looks like Christian has a question. Your NgRx Data WebSocket client will work with other servers rather than Nest, as long as they are WebSockets. Like if I implement my server of WebSockets and .NET, I'm assuming it's .NET Core, for example. Yeah, so the client doesn't assume anything about your backend. It just assumes that the events that are dispatched and events that it receives are in a certain form. So there's the 3 libraries, right? There's the client, there's the core, and there's the server. The core is what has all of the typings in it. So they're TypeScript types. If your backend like .NET Core doesn't use TypeScript, by all means, write your own types or your own whatever, as long as they follow the typings that are in core, right? The events need to be named something. The event needs to be structured in a certain way, stuff like that. But yes, the client can be used with whatever backend you want, as long as you abide by the event structure and event names. You're welcome.
Can I make a question like this instead of just typing? Okay.
Sure.
Thank you. With NgRx, when you want to do test-driven development, it's very good for doing that, because you can basically use the test bed and create the dependency injection, and you are able to create unit tests to test the logic of your reducers, your actions, and everything, right? You basically dispatch events, like for example, if you're receiving data, supposedly, right, between quotes, you're receiving data like from the event of the WebSocket, you can basically dispatch that event without having to have a real WebSocket dispatching those events back to you. So my question is how your library allows to continue doing that sort of testing, and that will go for your library and also for NgRx data too. Is NgRx data somehow preventing me for continue doing that sort of unit testing? Those are the questions.
So yeah, it does unfortunately remove a little bit of your flexibility there, because you're not injecting the store directly with NgRx Data. You're injecting the data service itself, right? So you would have to provide a mock implementation for the data service itself, which means that you could, mock the data service and then have it, return. You could be like, mock return value, or I don't know what testing library you're using, but you could force that mocked data service to return stuff. Or what you could do as well is not mock the data service, inject import NgRx data normally, and then use the HTTP testing module, I think it's called, to mock the actual like HTTP call itself. So you let NgRx do everything that it's going to do. You don't mock anything there. It's just when it actually goes to make that XHR request, the testing module takes over and says, okay, well, I know that it's a get. I'm supposed to overwrite the body with this, so I'll just return that. And then data works the way that it normally does.
I see.
Yeah, with the WebSocket implementation specifically, it gets a little bit weird because as you like with the event, like WebSocket events, right? So I don't think that situation really works, unfortunately. I haven't really figured out a way to make that work quite yet. We're not using this in production yet. It's just something that I built over a weekend one time. But it's something that I definitely want to look into, because I would like to be able to, mock those event request responses and then make sure that the store is reducing correctly, and then my, UI updates.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Any more questions? If not, I've got one. Not necessarily WebSocket related, but I know some point when I looked into NgRx Data, it was very difficult to handle relational data, and it might still be. I haven't looked into it for a good time. So, and I think they were saying there on the documentation that you have to handle it on your own, kind of. So I'm not sure if there's any updates on that, if you know.
Yeah, so it doesn't assume anything about relations. It doesn't set up relations at all in your data store. You are, more than welcome to write your own selectors, so that you can write, essentially what they are is a relational selectors. So you have your one parent, say you have, like board, so like a Kanban board, right? And then story. You could write a selector that, select board and stories, and you base it off of a query param or a route param, whatever. You select your board, and then you use your entity selector to pull in all of your stories and filter those by the board ID, right? Assuming your story has a board ID on it, right? And then you would return that, so that you're getting a board with an array of stories, kind of thing. But you would have to do that kind of relational management through selectors. I don't know of anything that NgRx Data supports to build out that relational type stuff.
Yeah,
natively in the library.
Yeah, I think it was a URL something like, we had two IDs, so you have user /7, then say stories /6, for example, I don't know. And then how would you, because NgRx Data has its own way of, forming those API requests. So I had, it wasn't geared for this sort of API request, I think, at that time. So I'm not sure if that changed or if there's a way to pass in parameter, because I wanted to create my own API service there, but I couldn't pass parameters, so I had to fake it around and pass it in as a can't remember, there was like a tag or something, and put it in there in that property
So it assumes some things, like when you're doing the add, it assumes that all you're sending is the body of the entity that you want to add, right? Same with update. Delete is just the primary key. Get with query, you can actually pass, it'll just use query params and then send it to the server. If you did want to have your server return relational data, so like you query for a board and then it returns the board with the board's stories, you can overwrite the data service implementation and say, okay, well, when I query for a board, I know that I'm getting board plus stories. Well, then I will reshape that and return multiple actions instead of just the default one. I believe you can do that because that's all the WebSocket libraries that I built, is I'm just overwriting the default data service implementation. So your board, like, then they have docs on it. They're not great, but they're getting better. There are docs on writing custom data service implementation, so you might be able to get around it like that, but it's not really something that's in there out of the box.
Okay, I have another question. If you are using a store and you are using WebSocket, doesn't it make more sense to push the store to the server and don't have a store in the browser at all?
I mean, yeah, I guess it depends on your use case, right? Like, if you're not having the store in the browser at all, then don't use NgRx at all, right? Like if your store is just on the server and you're like, where are you storing your data? You need to have the data that the client's currently displaying, right?
Yeah, that is usually on the server anyway.
Yeah. So I mean, yes and no, depends. Yeah, NgRx might be overkill if you're only ever storing like very small slices of currently being displayed UI state, right?
Yeah, but that should be what you're doing in our proper front end anyway.
Yeah, so